Hey guys, Zenji Nishikawa of Famitsu Magazine recently said at a YouTube livestream that he had a huge scoop of poop that he was going to drop about Sega on June 4th.
The news was so big, in fact, that it would revolutionize the video game industry.
This got people all over the world all riled up and dreamcasting about what Sega's announcement could possibly be. Some speculated there would be a brand new Sega console. Others thought perhaps Sega was being purchased by Microsoft, or that the new Xbox would get a special Sega-oriented marketing campaign in Japan.
Well, the news is in, and it's something that Sega is calling Fog Gaming, which is essentially a cloud service that's going to let Japanese arcade goers play their arcade games at home. You know, after the arcades have all closed.
Okay.
This isn't news that would really have an impact in the US, on account of our basically not having arcades anymore. But the Japanese should be pretty excited. Now you can play arcade games at home. Just like in 1987 when the Sega Genesis came out, you could play arcade games at home. Or like in 1994 when the Sega Saturn came out and Sega promised that you could play arcade games at home. Well, now Japanese people will get to play even more arcade games at home.
You want to revolutionize the dead arcade industry? Then let them play at home. If it worked over 30 years ago, it might work now too. Hopefully.
But June has brought other, even more strange news from Sega. Sega has officially announced that they are releasing a Sega Game Gear Micro console.
Wait, what's a Game Gear?
Where are my manners? I'm sorry. You were born in 2012, the same year that Halo 4 came out. For you, the Sega Dreamcast is retro, but for me, that's still the new stuff. And so for your sake, let me put on my crusty old memory cap here, and we can go back to the past and talk about some old games that didn't suck ass.
The original Sega Game Gear is a handheld video game console released in Japan in October of 1990, and in North America and Europe in April of 1991, about 18 months after the original launch of the extraordinarily successful Nintendo Game Boy. The Game Gear was built around the same hardware as the 8-bit Sega Master System, and offered players significant improvements over the Game Boy, most obvious of which is the bright, full-color backlit screen, promising to have games that looked head and shoulders above what the Game Boy was capable of. Neither console, however, was really that good in the screen department. While the Game Boy's screen was almost impossible to see unless you were in absolutely perfect lighting conditions, the Game Gear's bright and blurry backlit LCD was so bad that it made you feel like you'd go blind.
Why else do y'all think I need glasses?
However, as bad as the screen was, the Game Gear was undeniably more comfortable to hold and play than the rectangular Game Boy, and it was still just as portable as Nintendo's big gray brick, at least in theory. But the Game Gear's real Achilles heel was its unforgivably short battery life. A portable Master System with a bright backlit LCD screen requires a lot of juice, and so the Game Gear required 6 AA batteries that lasted between 3 and 5 hours, at best. This, for me, meant carrying around a bulky AC adapter that came with the unit, which is not really a very portable thing to do. At $150, the Game Gear was overall a failure, when compared to Nintendo's $90 Game Boy, which sold a staggering 118.69 million units. The Game Gear was on the market for around 6 years, and only sold around 10.62 million units worldwide, making it not quite as successful as Sega's own Master System.
And you all know how popular the Sega Master System was.
The truth is that while the Game Gear was absolutely crushed by Nintendo's Game Boy, in terms of total sales, it was a very visible and important part of the retail video game scene during its 6-year lifespan. When compared to the rest of the competition, such as the Turbo Express or the Atari Lynx, the Game Gear was a serious contender. Ultimately, there were around 366 games developed for the Game Gear, many of which were never released in North America. However, since the Game Gear isn't region locked, it's actually possible to play any of the games meant for Europe or Japan on any Game Gear, and that's pretty awesome. At launch, there were a handful of great games available, including an outstanding port of Mickey's Castle of Illusion, the Master System version of course, a decent version of Wonder Boy, and Columns, which I consider the system seller. Who doesn't love Columns? And there were many other high-quality games eventually released for the system, including a very popular take on the Shinobi series, a fantastic entry in the Shining Force series, a really good port of Streets of Rage 2, and a ton of high-quality entries in the Sonic the Hedgehog series. There are actually just as many Sonic games on the Game Gear as there are on the Sega Genesis, 32X, and Sega Saturn combined. Sadly, despite having a good game library, the Game Gear was more known for schlocky, half-assed portable ports of popular Genesis games. If there was a popular game or series of games on the Genesis, then you'd better bet that there was at least one crappy, truncated 8-bit version of that game released for the Game Gear. So while there were really great games made for the Game Gear, the console wasn't really known for them, as those titles are often buried in a pile of ports and cash grabs.
So that, my young friend, is the sad, sad story of the Sega Game Gear.
So let me get this straight. Sega is re-releasing the Game Gear, an old failed handheld console, but now they've made it so small that it fits in the palm of your hand?
You got it.
Hey, just was wondering, is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
I wish.
The Game Gear Micro is baffling. Here are the facts.
The Game Gear Micro is only 3 inches wide, about 1.5 inches tall, and less than 1 inch thick. The screen itself is unfathomably tiny, at just over 1 inch across diagonally, making it roughly 1/3 the size of the original Game Gear screen.
I can't see anything.
I guess some things never change.
It has a single mono speaker. It has an earphone jack, so even if the screen is too small to use, at least you'll be able to hear the games. It can be charged via a USB cable or by 2 AAA batteries. There's going to be 4 different colors available. There's Classic Black, then there's Sonic the Hedgehog Blue, as well as Ridiculous Red and Pika Pika Pikachu Yellow.
But these aren't just fashionable aesthetic choices. Each color comes with a completely unique library of games, probably in an attempt to incentivize people to collect them all.
So, how many games are we talking about here?
Ooh, you're not gonna like it.
What do you mean?
There are only 16 games.
16? That kinda sucks. But 16 games for each color should be enough to show people what the Game Gear was all about, so...
No, dude, I mean 16 games total. As in, if you collect all 4. There's only 4 games on each unit.
Are you serious? 4 games? That's it?
Yes, and if you have tiny baby-sized hands and can both see and read Japanese text, then these games are actually pretty awesome.
So what games are we dealing with here?
Well, there's no Western release planned for this as of yet, and a lot of the games on here are actually never given an English translation. So if this ever did come to our neck of the woods, you can expect that we're going to have a completely different game library. But for the sake of completion, let's just take a look at what the Japanese are getting anyway.
The Black Game Gear comes with 4 games. Sonic the Hedgehog is a highly underrated game that is actually the first game ever developed by Yuzo Koshiro's own game development company, Ancient. The overall game was directed by his sister Ayano, and of course Yuzo Koshiro provides the music. There are major differences between this game and the Sega Genesis original. In fact, this is a completely different game with an almost completely different playstyle that emphasizes traditional, methodical platforming and exploration over jolting speed. I know it's heretical, but I actually prefer the gameplay in this game over the Sega Genesis original. Puyo Puyo 2 is an extremely impressive port of Compile's beloved arcade puzzler. It never came out in the West, though the original Puyo Puyo was ported as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, a game that was fairly well known, but which never reached the levels of popularity that Puyo Puyo achieved in Japan. This is a good game with a lot of personality, and it's on par with virtually any other puzzle block dropping game that came out in the 90s. Except of course for the original Tetris, that game still owns. However, what's sad about this game is that the original release was 2-player with the so-called gear-to-gear cable. I'm not sure Sega is going to accommodate that, so this game probably won't retain its full level of functionality, and that always sucks. Sega's super scaling games were at one time the biggest stars of the arcade scene. My favorite of that bunch was always Outrun, a car-based game that was more of a cross-country joyride than it was an actual racer. Its greatest achievement was probably its amazing soundtrack, which I frequently listen to this day. The Genesis was sadly never able to capture that sense of motion and speed generated by Sega's superscaling technology, and how much worse off was the itty-bitty Game Gear. This is a valiant effort that plays surprisingly well, considering its stripped-down, primitive nature, but it just can't capture the magic of the arcade original. It's a neat addition for the namesake and the legacy that this game holds in the history of gaming, but perhaps the Game Gear version was better off left alone to begin with. Again, this is another game that allowed for 2-player play with a gear-to-gear cable, so it's kind of sad there isn't likely to be full functionality of the game made available here. Royal Stone is a Japanese exclusive that I personally know very little about. It's a sequel to the critically acclaimed strategy RPG Crystal Warriors, a game that played like Sega's answer to Fire Emblem. It's a shame this game never got an English translation, and that I never learned fluent Japanese, because it looks and sounds like it would have been awesome. The blue Game Gear also comes with 4 games. Sonic and Tails is actually the third traditional Sonic game developed for the Game Gear, and the second developed by Aspect, a small company that made some of the very best games for the Game Gear. I knew this game as Sonic Chaos, and what it is a solid Sonic game that lets you play as either Sonic or Tails. Despite the Game Gear's lack of speed, there was more of an attempt here to tap into the level rushing theme established by the original Mega Drive games. That's tough to do, however, when the screen is both tiny and zoomed in so far that you can barely tell what's coming toward you until it's too late. Overall though, it's still a good Sonic game, and it has astonishingly good graphics for the platform. Gunstar Heroes was one of the very best games on the Mega Drive, and it turns out that it's also one of the very best games for the Game Gear too. Originally developed by Treasure, this Game Gear version was done by M2, and while it's missing a lot of content from the original, this version pulls off some kind of a miracle. It's too good. It shouldn't even be possible, but here it is. Gunstar Heroes is a run and gun in the vein of Contra 3 with a lot of dynamic shifts in gameplay and a heavy emphasis on difficult boss encounters. M2 did an amazing job capturing the fast-moving graphics and explosiveness of the original, but unfortunately that same commitment makes this game kind of hard to follow on the original Game Gear screen. I think this game is probably going to be impossible to play on a screen as tiny as the one found here. It's still a great game though. Silvan Tail is an amazing looking action RPG that was, once again, never given an official English translation. I do, however, remember playing a patched version of this game years ago, and being very impressed with it. It reminds me of Crystalis in the best way possible. I wish I had more to say about this. I wish Sega had given this game a US release to begin with. Baku Animal is a port of a quirky arcade puzzler developed by Sega in the mid-90s. As far as these kinds of games go, it's actually great. We all learned in kindergarten that certain animals eat certain types of food, right? Well, all you have to do in this game is line up the animal face to a string of their favorite food and watch them munch away. It's awesome. Once again, this game is a 2-player game that allowed for gear-to-gear cable connectivity, and as far as I know, there's no plan for making that possible on these micro consoles. Bummer. The red Game Gear Micro has not one, but 2 different Japanese exclusive entries in the Megami Tensei series. Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Battle was released in the West as Revelations, the Demon Slayer for the Game Boy Color. But here's the Japanese exclusive Game Gear version. I've never played this, but I've heard it described as Pokemon with demons. It sounds like a satanic nightmare, even worse than Harry Potter themed lingerie, and yes, that's really a thing. The other Megami Tensei game is the confusingly titled Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Battle Special, which is a completely different kind of game. It's an old school first-person dungeon crawler. Again, unless you speak Japanese and can read text smaller than the tip of a pinhead, then neither of these games is going to matter for you. But the Red Micro also comes with the GG Shinobi, widely considered one of the best platformers ever made for the Game Gear, and one of those games that pretty much everyone with a Game Gear seems to have had. Following in the footsteps of Revenge of Shinobi for the Sega Genesis, we get a badass soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro and clever level design that constantly keeps you on your toes. New, however, is the ability to play as multiple ninjas, each with their own unique abilities that need to be utilized at various places in order to progress in the game. The only problem is that this is another one of those Game Gear games that was always really hard to see unless you had absolutely perfect lighting conditions and really good eyesight. I can't imagine anyone being able to play the river stage on that ultra tiny 1-inch screen. The last game on the Red Micro is Columns, another game that everyone had. What can I say? It's Columns! Take it or leave it. Will 2-player mode be made available? Maybe, but probably not. The yellow Micro Game Gear interests me the most because it includes the complete Shining Force Gaiden trilogy. Shining Force Gaiden, Shining Force Gaiden 2, and Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict. And they're all in Japanese, of course. Indeed, only Shining Force the Sword of Hija, the second one, was ever released in English as a Game Gear game. If you've never played any Shining Force games, then all you really need to know is that it's an awesome strategy RPG with beautiful Dragon Slayer-like art style. The original series on the Mega Drive is among my favorite games of all time, at least when played through the lens of nostalgia. Shining Force Gaiden 1 and 2 would both be remade for the Sega CD, and that actually did get an English release, which is cool. But again, on the Game Gear, only Shining Force Gaiden 2 has an official English translation. The other game, which I have never heard of until now, is Nazo Poyo Aruru no Ru, which appears to be a Puyo Puyo RPG with puzzler play mechanics. It's completely in Japanese, no official English translation exists, and therefore I am most likely never going to get to play it anyway, though I can say that it does look very interesting. In fact, the Game Gear was riddled with great looking games just like this that never got a US release, as you can plainly tell just from watching this video.
So that's the Sega Game Gear Micro, and it's 4 different color packages. And as you can see, it has a lot of really neat Japanese RPGs here with a lot of text that were never given English translations.
Because when you have a screen that's just over an inch across, games dependent upon reading lots of tiny pixelated text is probably the best way to go.
Wrong, dude! It is exactly the wrong way to go!
So what exactly is Sega thinking with this product? I mean, this is a device intended for people who are now approaching 40 years of age. And let me tell you, just reading my emails on my big ass smartphone is becoming a chore at my age. I can't see anything. How am I supposed to play Shining Force on the world's smallest Game Gear screen?
I get that tiny retro consoles are a thing, but this is an instance wherein making it smaller is actually a really bad idea. I mean, how am I even supposed to grip it and play it? Also, I don't have to tell you how insane it is that it only comes with 4 games apiece. Even if you get all 16 games in one, that would still be minuscule compared to every other mini console on the market. But 4? 4 is just ridiculous.
Well, maybe it's just like a novelty toy or something. Maybe they should just turn these into nifty keychains.
Sure, that's what I thought too. With so few games and being so small that it's functionally useless, I thought that basically this was going to be some sort of cheap novelty toy. but they're selling this thing for $50. $50! That's more than $12 a game for some old-ass Sega Game Gear games that aren't even playable unless you speak Japanese and have super tiny eyes. You can't play these!
Sega is also going to release a tiny version of the big window accessory, which is and was nothing more than a magnifying glass that you stick on top of your Game Gear screen. There's a big catch, however, as the only way to get one is to fork over around $250 for a set that includes all 4 Game Gear micros in one box. Doing some quick math, you can figure out that the big window itself costs something like $50, just by itself.
Obviously, if Sega ever decides to release this in the US, they're gonna have to use a completely different library of games. But $50? For 4 games on a mini console so small that it's basically useless? Are you freaking kidding me? This thing is dead in the water. No one is gonna buy this.
In fact, the only way I actually would buy one of these, even if it were $5, was if it really were a freaking keychain. Just look at them. They look like carnival prizes or something.
Sega, let me help you out here. Bringing back the Sega Game Gear isn't necessarily a bad idea. It's not. But having a mini console that has a screen that is 1 inch across diagonally and that's so small that you can't actually play it doesn't even make any sense. So in our next video, we're going to explore what we would have done with this concept. Because honestly, the Sega Game Gear is a great product and it deserves better treatment than what it's getting here.
What did you guys think of Sega's big announcement?
And what do you think about Sega's micro announcement? Please, let us know in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching. Bye!
Catch you in the future, homies!
Yeet!